additional money to these hospitals? I'm thinking kind of like Metro General. If you don't go with the Medicaid expansion, would that be something you would?
Well, it could. I don't know that we would have enough money to make them whole, to be honest with you. I don't know. And that's the other thing we've asked is we've asked the hospitals, remember, they have everything from the Metro Generals in Nashville to the Med in Memphis to hospital chains to small rural publicly owned hospitals, and so we've asked to look at all of their economics to understand that. I don't think there's a situation where we could compensate them enough to make it up for what they're going to lose.
What do you want an answer from hospitals? You're asking the hospitals specifically. Have you told them we'd like to have this by a certain time?
Well, they know that we'd like that. We haven't exactly given them a date. I think, and we know we won't get it before the first of the year. It'll be after the first of the year sometime. And like I say, it's just to help us understand their economics.
If you don't expand, won't local governments end up paying for these people that are not covered in any way?
Well, those folks aren't covered now. And so the situation wouldn't be really any different now, except for the hospitals who are caught in that squeeze.
Can I move on to another topic?
I've said everything I know already.
This is something that's come up in the past week with the Newtown, Connecticut shooting.
Right.
Obviously, gun issues are, before this happened, guns and trumps,
right.
Whether or not to exclude campuses.
Right.
This was already getting heavily talked about. Legislation's in the works, and now there's a lot of talk about arming legislation to arm teachers. Kind of where do you stand on all of these things right now?
Well, there's a lot of different issues and potential resolutions to questions in there. So let me try to break those out. I mean, I've heard the people say, well, we should arm teachers. Well, I don't. That's an interesting question. I know a whole lot of teachers that wouldn't want to be armed, and so how does that work? If a principal says no thanks, I've got a daughter who's a second grade teacher, and I mean that's the last thing just knowing her, that's the last thing she'd want to do. So I don't. To me, it's hard to see what kind of how much we gain in doing that. I do think you have to separate this. I think there's an ongoing discussion in Tennessee about our current laws and the whole guns and guns and locked cars issues versus we have a bigger issue around kind of mass violence that's taken over. It happens much more frequently in our country. I've seen the numbers going back like to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, thousands, and then now the first part of the tens about the number of mass, horrific killings we've had like this, and that number keeps going up. And it doesn't seem to be there doesn't seem to be a lot of variance relative to gun laws and other things. So while I'm not saying, guns are the issue of guns is not germane to the discussion. There's a whole lot of factors in there, and I do think we need to have that discussion. I mean, because it hadn't just happened at schools; it happened at movie theaters and malls and a lot of other places. And so, again, I think as a country we need to have a discussion about what is going on here.
And the president earlier today, basically appointed a task force, and it looks like he's trying to move on a federal level. And some people say, well, geez, if they're moving on a federal level towards looking at some possible gun control, Tennessee seems to be moving in the opposite direction, which is expanding gun rights.
Yeah.
I mean, is that fair, and is that something that's a priority for you?
Well, I think this. The country's move has been in the last 3 days, okay? So I don't know that, Tennessee will have a discussion in January, and I do think it will be colored by the events of last week. I don't know how that discussion won't be. Now, I'm not saying it's going to turn one way or the other, but I do think it will be a little bit different discussion because of what happened at Sandy Hook. Is it a priority for me? It's a priority for me in this sense. I mean, like I said, my daughter teaches second grade. You look at funerals of 6-year-old kids, and you can't, if you don't have a pit in your stomach, something's wrong with you, okay? So I think having that discussion about what is going on here, and you hear people blame everything from video games to guns to changes in culture and society. I think we really do need to have that discussion. In terms of the gun legislation in Tennessee, we've always said that that wasn't going to be our focus. I mean, here are the things that we really are focusing on. I do think the overall safety and security of the state is part of our responsibility, so we want to be a part of that discussion. But in terms of us proposing legislation, some of the legislation that was proposed before, I mean, that just hasn't been a priority. Again, the prior discussion, that hasn't been a priority of ours. It will be a priority of ours to have a discussion about what do we do to address this.
Would you be willing to help out some of these counties, like Williamson County's going to discuss putting SROs in elementary schools?
Yeah, well, remember a lot of systems. Like I said, when I was in Knoxville, we had SROs in almost every school, some of which the city paid for. Some of it was paid by the county school system, but even though the city didn't run the schools there, we paid for SROs in a lot of those schools. So that's happening a lot of places. I don't know that I see that. Again, that feels like very much of that's a local government responsibility. But again, the broader discussion, I think, is a really fair one. And I think, like I said, it's already been announced, we're going to have a discussion about school safety, in January, about do we need a different approach.
The Department of Education gives out about $5 million a year in school safety grants for everything from helping staff's SROs to video cameras, that kind of stuff. Right. Is that an area where you could see possibly, maybe increasing the amount in there?
Yeah, it could, and we're having those ongoing discussions about the budget. Again, the situation we're in is, there are a lot of things that I think we can, like I said, we've talked about. Are there, there's ghosts in this building, don't worry. There's, our mental health department funds crisis stabilization units, and those were things that were on the chopping block a couple of years ago. But, are funding those, do those make, do we need to pay a little bit more attention there? So I guess my point is there are a lot of things we can do as a state that would help. We do have limited dollars, so we have to decide, well, what are the things that really will make a difference?
You said you're not going to take, you're not going to be proposing guns in trucks, guns in schools. Will you maybe try to encourage lawmakers not to push for those?
Well, I've said, there's certain things I said before. I do think, if something is passed, I do think schools should be exempted. And I've said that before. And
you said colleges.
But
when referenced, but
yeah, I would include high schools, middle schools, elementary schools in that as well. But I think it's the discussion on that really hasn't changed. I mean, you have this basic conflict between property rights. Does that property owner get to say what happens on his or her property? And how does that impact Second Amendment rights? And so I don't know that basic discussion has changed.
But let me ask this because it's something I've discovered in the last couple of days, which I think is very interesting. Just a couple hours ago, the Rutherford County Superintendent said he would be open to this debate about arming teachers. Mm-hmm. And the Rutherford County Sheriff is saying we are going to have SROs in all of our elementary schools. They now have 2. I talked to a woman yesterday, first time she fired a gun.
Right.
And the reason she was there that day was, because she said, I want to protect myself. I want to protect my kids. And she had a teacher's aide. I mean, it really seems this is a seismic shift here. And then Joe Carr is saying that he is going to introduce a bill, or thinking about introducing a bill, which would give local school districts that ability to, if they wanted to have teachers who have permits and are properly trained, like a sheriff. Rutherford County Sheriff has said he would do this kind of thing. If there's this law, then let the locals decide.
Yeah, I think,
this is all stuff that hadn't been talked about until 6.
It has, and it's interesting. I mean, I think, the words of it's a seismic shift, but it's kind of both ways. You have some people saying, I don't want any more guns around anywhere, and other people say, hey, I'm going to go buy.
I'm
going to say, other people say, exactly. So other people saying, I'm going to go buy a gun. I'm going to get my carry permit because I don't want to be in that situation. So, a situation as horrific as this has kind of pushed people both directions on the gun debate. So I actually think having that would be good. One of the other things having the debate about what that looks like, right? And I do think one of the other principles you just touched on there is, well, who gets to decide? And so you kind of went back to maybe what's a fundamental principle? Okay, if that's the local school board, and that local municipality, that local school board says we want to do that, that's very different from us saying, here's what you have to do. I do think, and remember back, I guess 3 years ago, remember all the argument about guns in bars and guns in parks, and the principle kind of came back to whoever owns the property should get to decide. So that city should get to decide, do they want that to happen in the park, in their parks, or that bar owner should get to decide, do I want that to happen in my bar, which kind of goes back to the principle that you were talking about.
Probably have time for one or two more.
Well, I'm assuming that we need legislation to allow guns in schools. Is that?
I don't know the
You
answer.
want to do what Sheriff Arnold was doing, a law of these.
That could be. I don't know the
We
answer.
can put more SRO, but I think it's.
Yeah, but whether a teacher could right now, if they have a permit, I don't know. Could that person, could he or she carry? I don't know.
Would you veto such a law if it came out?
I don't know enough to, like I said, I don't know that I've spent a whole lot of time being thoughtful about what that would mean. If the local school board says we want to give people the right to do that, I haven't spent enough time to do that. Carrie, go ahead.
Let me get a question in on, if it's okay, on
Sure.
something else. The voucher thing, I saw in the paper when you talked to
Right.
the print people yesterday that you don't know whether this is something that you guys will necessarily be pushing, but somebody in the legislature is going to push it. Is there a line in the sand? I mean, it sounds like you guys are grappling with the same things the task force did.
Right.
Amount, who qualifies. Is there a line in the sand for if the legislature comes up with something? I mean, you know.
Well, in terms of what we would,
what you would accept as a
I think, and by the way, like I said, we could end up proposing the bill ourselves. What I told the group yesterday was, and it really wasn't anything new. I've said all along, there will be a bill. It might be ours, and it might be somebody in the legislatures, and we'll have a view on that. There are certain things I do think are important. We've talked a whole lot about accountability. You know, it's why we've had, we're using data more, we're using evaluations, and it's hard for me to justify public dollars since we have this big push on accountability going and following the child, which I think, I think there's a whole lot of merit in that. It's hard for me to see that without some sort of accountability. I also feel like if we're going to do this, our at least initial step should be means tested, should be low-income children. Beyond that, it gets harder. Low-income children in schools that are failing or all low-income children, regardless of what school they're in. How much money follows the child, and then what schools are eligible. I mean, those are the hard things.
The other thing is already districts like even Williamson County has passed a resolution, I think, at their last meeting that said they don't want it because they're afraid if they open it
Sure.
up where the money can follow the child across district lines, they're anticipating a bunch of metro kids wanting to come.
Yeah, and I have some questions about that too, just in terms of everything from, now you're into BEP funding formulas. It's different for one county versus the other, and so I understand some people believe that, okay, if the money should follow a child, they should be able to go to a public school anywhere they want just as well as a private school. I think that does lead to some issues, again, around BEP funding and some things that when you start crossing county lines.
What will, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, does this kind of indicate, though, that there's some pretty widespread dissatisfaction among parents with the school system, that you've got all these potential this exodus, or
Well, I put it this way. As a parent, I think most parents would say they're going to always want what's best for their child. And I know a lot of parents that have different children in the same family that do different things. I'll have this one in a public school, this one goes to a private school, and I'm homeschooling this one. I literally know families that do across the board, and they choose what's best for that child. I wouldn't go so far to say there's widespread dissatisfaction with our school system, because I think there's a whole lot of parents that are very, very pleased. And also, like I said, I want to emphasize, regardless of what happens with vouchers, regardless of what happens with charter schools, the vast majority of our kids are always going to be in public schools. And you're going to see us spend the vast majority of our education time on public schools because, again, that's where most of our kids are going to be.